before I get into the tutorial of how to use watercolor, I kind of just want to show you some different things. These are all going to be watercolor that I show you. And one thing that you can kind of notice is that they all have like a nice white border around them. That's because I taped the edges. And the edges being taped serves two purposes. One, it gives you a really nice, pretty edge that you can use for framing or when you're handling your painting. But the other thing is that it keeps it tight to the table or to your board while it dries, so that it dries flat instead of super wavy and buckled. That's especially true if you have a lighter, like thinner paper that is more susceptible to crinkling. Hey kitty. Not right now. Okay. The other thing that I want you to notice is that watercolor, when it's wet, will blend. So these paintings that I did of the Mackinac Bridge, I'm impatient and I like to just paint while it's still wet, but in order to do so I have to leave a white line in between the tree and the sky, or else it'll all just blend together. And actually for these paintings it ends up, I think, being like a nice design quality to have that white line separating. But if you don't have that white line separating those areas of paint that are wet, you're gonna have to work in layers and slowly. So for this one, I would have started kind of painting in the water and then maybe up here on the sky, and then just let it dry. And then go back in and paint in this part of the sky, let it dry. Then start to paint in the land, let it dry. So it can be a medium that requires some patience, and that can be sort of fun if you have multiple paintings going on at once. You could have like 4 paintings, work on one, set it aside, let it dry, pull out another one, work on it while the other one's drying, and that's often what I do. So we'll revisit these after the tutorial. Okay, tip number 1 is to tape your watercolor paper down on all 4 sides. That serves as 2 purposes. For one, it just makes a pretty nice border on the edge. The other purpose is that as your watercolor dries, it's gonna keep it nice and flat so it doesn't get super buckled. That's especially helpful if you're using a watercolor paper that's pretty lightweight. If you're using masking tape, you might want to stick it to your pants a couple of times so it's not too sticky. This stuff here is washi tape and it's not nearly as sticky. In fact, it's not ideal, but my masking tape just ran out, so that's why I'm using it. All right, I'm gonna run through a few different options with watercolor, and I'll do some speeding up as we go here. But just so you know, I'm using about 140 pound watercolor paper. That just means that when it's in a ream, it would weigh 140 pounds when you got a big packet of it. So 140 pounds is pretty good. You can get like 300 pounds, but a lot of the time, if you were just to buy a regular watercolor pad like at Michael's, it would be like a 90 pound paper. So just keep that in mind. That actually does make a pretty big difference, the way that the watercolor handles on the paper, depending on the type of paper you get. So another note is I'm using watercolors that came out of a tube, but they're basically the same thing because mine are all dried up now. So anyway, just a couple little considerations. Got my water, got my brushes, ready to go. So what I'm gonna do for this one is I'm gonna work on making another Empire Beach scene. So like I said before, I'm gonna start off with the water in the sky. And when I'm doing that, that's called a wash. So I'm gonna use a brush that's appropriate for a wash, which is kind of loose, meaning it's not like a super stiff brush, and it's nice and wide, so this would be a good one. I don't know if I have any in the classroom, but this would also be a good one just to do a nice loose wash. And then I dip my brush just in the water here to thin it out if you want to have a lighter pigment. And I'm going to have it fade down into orange here, so I'm just going to leave that white, and I'll revisit that later when it's dry. If I tried to put orange right now, they would blend, and it might not be that bad, but actually orange and blue are opposites on the color wheel, so when they mix, they make kind of a brownish color, and I don't really want brown in my sky, so I'm not going to have them mix. And I'm gonna leave this part white because I wanna revisit that again with orange as well. And at this point, I might wanna tinker around with putting in a little bit of a darker blue. And the cool thing here is that since my paper is already pretty wet, you can kind of see the sheen that it's wet. You can sort of start to drop in other color. And it's going to, this is called wet on wet. So we just did a wash, and this is called wet on wet, where you're painting a wet color on top of a wet color. And using water here to help move it around the paper. The water is the vehicle in paint, so that means it helps it move around the paper. And then I can just use water to help thin it and have it slowly move across where I want it to go. All right, so now I have to leave that alone. This is where patience is very important with watercolor. So I'm gonna go ahead and slide my board up here and visit this one down here, which I have a portrait. I'm gonna go ahead and lay down a really light skin tone. To be careful because it's by some green on my palette and I don't really want a greenish skin tone for this one. And I'm just gonna lay it over the whole face for now, and I want it to be pretty light. If you end up making, like let's say that I put some down and it's like way too dark right there and I don't like it, you can use paper towel and watch what happens when I blot it. It really lightens it. It can soak it up quite a bit. Now that only works if you have a heavier watercolor paper. The 90-pound watercolor paper, it might just stain your paper and not really soak it up as much, but it's worth a shot if you want to. And I use this trick a lot in my paintings. So it sort of just lightly stains that paper. And then you can work in shadows and highlights. All right, so I have that face. I want to do something dark for the hair, and I want to do something dark for the background. But if I mess with the background, it could end up mixing with my face. So I'm going to show you a fun trick right now. See if I can zoom in on it. Watercolor paint will only go where there's water on your paper, in a sense, obviously, unless you actually paint it there. So what I could do is take a brush that has a little bit more of a finer tip, dip it in the water, and then just draw a fine line away from that face so that there's a little white, dry, a little area of dry paper in between my face and the background. And then just kind of add some water. So I'm not even really painting right now with paint, I'm just using water. Painting with water. But this way, if I make a mistake, it's just water on my paper, it's no big deal. And then while it's still wet, now I can take some of my pigment, my color, and just plop it in there. And you can see that it's only traveling where the water is. To see it's moving down. It's pretty fun. All right, so I finished in my background. My face is still slightly damp, so I'm gonna revisit that later. And then my Empire dunes there is still quite wet, you can see. So I'm just gonna leave that alone for a little while. All right, a couple more things I just want you to be aware of is that watercolor doesn't have to be used all by itself. So this one was done all in watercolor. The only thing that was not done in watercolor was the stars. I added those with acrylic paint at the very end. So that's totally fine. You can rely on other materials to help create your art piece. This lovely lady with her snail shirt was done with watercolor, but then I took some little like fine tip pens and did some line work on top. I used a white paint marker on the hat, so the background was all watercolor. So again, you can kind of mix and match materials to suit your needs. And the last thing I want to talk to you about is something called wet on dry. So just don't think that once you've created a painting, you're just done. Because something like this, which I made last week, it is all dry now. I could just call it done, but there's a lot of fun stuff I can do now that it's dry. I could take a fine tip paintbrush and I can start to paint on top of this to create patterns. I could write words. I could just do lines. But it's pretty satisfying to start painting in these really nice crisp lines on top now that my painting is all dry, because my watercolor is not going to blend and go all over the place. I can make these super nice smooth lines. So consider working into your painting even when you think it's done. How can you add something that has a little bit more visual interest in the painting?